Welcome to Controllers Classified, the podcast where we take a deep dive into the dynamic world of controllers, accountants, and finance leaders, and hear how their ever-evolving roles are redefining accounting and the future of business. And now, here's your host, Erik Zhou.
Welcome to Controllers Classified. I'm your host, Erik Zhou, Chief Accounting Officer at Brex. And I'm honored today to have Richie Mashiko on the podcast. Richie is a fractional CFO serving a variety of high-growth companies, especially in the e-com and CPG space. Today, we get to pick his brain on best practices for managing capital, optimization of operations for these companies. So let's get into it. And in a timely time, because I think one of the topics today around tariffs is going to be really interesting. So Richie, welcome to the show.
Erik, thank you so much. I do a little bit of podcasting myself, so know how hard the intros could be. So that was an awesome intro, man. Love it.
We should definitely trade notes after. I'd love to talk to other podcasters and learn more. How did you get into this business? Because I think you got an interesting background to share with the audience.
Yeah, 100%. Yeah. So, quick notes. So I grew up in LA, went to high school, born and raised, and I ended up going to Cal Berkeley, UC Berkeley for a year, and left school after the first year. So I don't know if I'm the first guest you might have who's not like a real accountant or whatever, but don't have like a formal finance education. But I've always I started my first business. You can kind of see up here. That was my first business. I started when I was a sophomore in high school with my best friend.
How did you get into that? Like, what drove you to start a business in high school? You get to hustle. You want to make some coin. Like, what's the deal?
Yeah. So the quick story is that I wanted to become a sports medicine doctor. Maybe some that was my dream, and then I believe
do your parents proud, get into medicine. I'm
gonna say a little bit of a joke,
with me.
But,
yeah,
you know how it is, right, brother? Like
yeah.
Those expectations. But I I played basketball and I broke my ankle, and then when you break your ankle, you just sit on the couch for a pretty long time. And I watched Shark Tank, the show called Shark Tank, and I was like, oh, that looks pretty cool. So I was like, hey, what's a cool idea me and my friend could start in? And that was the start of the entrepreneurial journey.
And so what was that first business, just out of curiosity?
It was a sock. It was like a sock brand. So at the time,
no kidding.
When I was in high school, like there's like these Nike Elites were like a big thing. Active socks, Vans socks, like Stance was like just coming out. So I was like, oh wow, like this is like a fun market. And
so you had an entrepreneurial bug, right? And you caught it, and you want to do your own thing. You went to school, what left after a year. Maybe just to dive right into the most burning question that I have: how do you go from 1 year of school or college to learning about all the debits, credits, finance things of being a fractional CFO? And frankly, like a pretty complex business when it comes down to all the operations of an e-com
Right.
and CPG company. Like, what was your journey there?
Well, I dropped out to try to do startups, and really the first thing that really worked was this brand called She's Birdie. I met one of the would-become founders, and I kept in touch with her, and she said, hey, me and my sister are starting this thing, and I always had an interest in e-commerce. Obviously, I always had an interest in selling stuff. And she said, could you help out? And I was like, yeah, I'd love to. And I really started on the growth marketing side. But a lot of what growth marketing is in e-commerce and in general, it is a lot of data analysis, numbers, tying, marketing metrics back to financial metrics. So in order to do my job, it just was kind of natural to be really tied into like the finance side of the house. And startup, you get to do a lot of stuff. So eventually kind of transition and took over a lot of the forecasting, the budgeting, eventually kind of overseeing the accounting operation, and then we did things like audits. So it was kind of really like learning on the job. But it was super awesome experience, and I've kind of taken that and I've tried to apply it and help other like high growth e-commerce businesses.
What years were this when you first started out working on growth marketing for these startups? Just out of curiosity.
I dropped out in 2017 and Birdie launched in
Got it.
2019. So it's been a 6-year, 6-8 year journey.
What are some of the strategies that you leveraged, and what are some of the calculations that you performed to assess how successful those strategies were? Like was it just paid ads and looking at like revenue generated from those, or like how did you tie the two together?
Exactly. So, in e-commerce, I have this framework. It's not original. Really someone that I learned from, a guy named Taylor Holiday, big person in e-commerce, is really looking at this idea of like the P&L and looking at it in 4 main buckets of revenue. You have like really 4 buckets of categories in like an e-commerce business. So the first bucket's like pretty common right across businesses, like the cost of goods in e-commerce that also accounts for shipping, fulfillment, etc. In addition to the hard cost of the goods. Second bucket is the G&A or the OpEx, so like the fixed costs of the business. And then really like the thing that makes e-commerce a little bit different is this bucket of advertising. A lot of these e-commerce businesses are dependent on the performance and the efficiency of paid ads on like Meta or Google, TikTok, etc. And that's, after COGS, that's like a huge, that's like the biggest line item in e-commerce, and could be even bigger than the COGS line item actually. And then for the last bucket is profit, right? So in an e-commerce business, the magic 4 quarters would be like if each of those buckets was 25% each of revenue. Typically that never happens. Really like the way that e-commerce businesses work is you are able to have really high operational leverage, right? With softwares and employees, to do an incremental $1-2 million in sales. It's not like a B2B, sales business or SaaS business where you need to add AEs and CSMs and things like that, right? You just push a button on Facebook and tell to spend more dollars on ads. So kind of having that framework, to answer your question, having that framework of, hey, like these are the buckets that we need to spend in, like what do we need to get our gross margin down to? Like luckily, like we stumbled to like Birdie was like actually one of like a really perfect e-commerce business, super high gross margin, super cheap to ship because it's light, small, compact. And we essentially leveraged Facebook ad dollars to grow that business and kept OpEx, or the G&A small. So, basically, once we have like kind of like a configured P&L, you say, hey, like what does our efficiency need to be, or what percentage of revenue can we spend on ads? And essentially in e-commerce, you just kind of spend up to that threshold.
I love that mental model, like the 25, 25, 25, because then you get the 25% profit margin. Uh, I think it's a great segue into a really interesting topic related to current events right now, tariffs. A lot of all kinds of CPG companies, and especially e-com companies, I think, they're getting their goods manufactured in a place that now costs 10% more to import. And so that drives your gross margin or your cost of goods sold up incrementally. And so how are people thinking about managing that risk and like what's going on? I know there's a pause right now. It's 10% right now, but there's a pause that will get lifted supposedly in early July. What's going on in your businesses and how are you thinking about mitigating those risks today?
Obviously, it depends on the business. A lot of the brands, like more like the hard good brands that I work with, that do manufacturing, do manufacture in China. Really like the CPG brands that do like their fill, like so like skincare, hair care, set things like that, cosmetics. A lot of that stuff is like done in labs and factories in the States. So the thing that they're getting hit on is really the packaging. But there's a couple things, right? From a straight pricing standpoint, this is like a, a really good time for brands to experiment with price testing. I think that's something that they just are, some founders are just scared to do, right? Because it's like, oh, it's like my baby, and I'm like, it feels like really, it's a really personal thing, right? Where you could just run like an A/B test and see if you could essentially drive a higher revenue per session with increasing your prices, right? Um, the other thing that brands are doing, and they've if you're a brand, you should start to do is try to diversify the supply chain, right? Not be so dependent on a single source, right? And even if and making sure those sources are kind of diversified, in countries, it's hard to forecast.
Has that been happening at your brands? Have they been actually going out there and strategically thinking about, okay, I can't get my supply from this country anymore, I have to look for alternatives? Like that's
Yes,
actively happening right now,
that's
I'm guessing.
actively happening right now.
Okay.
People are looking at Vietnam, other Southeast Asian countries,
I mean,
Mexico.
Apple just said all the phones that are going to get shipped in the future are going to come from India, apparently.
Yep.
So even one of the biggest CPG companies we know is doing that, right? So um, electronics, electronics at the end of the
100%.
day, but still consumer goods, right? I buy iPhones, etc.
It's a longer term fix, right? And it's hard for these small, and that's where like a lot of these small businesses are going to get crushed, in my opinion. Is these like e-commerce CPG businesses? They already run on really like thin margin, right? Like a healthy e-com brand might run at like 10-15%. Like that idea of 25-25-25 never happens,
Mm.
right? People, if you have like a decent brand, you might run at 10-15% margin. Like 20% is really, really rare. Um so and and a lot of the times they're not their supply chain isn't super robust, meaning like it's someone who contacts a factory on Alibaba, right, to say, hey, like I found you, could you like make my product for me? And that relationship kind of scales up over time. But there's not a lot of resources within these organizations to pivot on a dime. Say, right, maybe if you're an Apple or like one of these like larger conglomerates or whatever, you might have, right, the operational capability to be able to try to find redundancies in the supply chain, versus like a small brand. You're like, shit, like how do I just keep paying the bills like this month, right? And honestly, like some other brands that I'm working with are like, we're just gonna wait it out and see what happens.
Are they looking for American suppliers? Is there any chance of that happen? Oh, maybe not in the next 60 days, but I don't know. Maybe you're working with a brand that has enough of a runway, so to speak, to
Right,
afford themselves to look for a supplier in the U.S. that obviously there wouldn't be tariffs then, but
right,
but then the cost is high, right? Because the labor is higher.
right. No brand that I'm working with is actively looking for U.S. manufacturing, or from
Wow.
changing from, so this whole idea of reshoring a lot of these labor, these jobs is like, I think I mean, obviously, like to set up the manufacturing infrastructure that a place like China has doesn't happen overnight, right? So that's what we're kind of dealing with. What I'm kind of advising my brands to do: try to find those redundancies in supply chain, increase your prices, and then also if there's any other places where you could find margin in the business, um, find that margin, right? Maybe you're overbloated on your on your G&A expenses, right?
Are
Maybe
you
there's
cutting down on ad spend?
yeah, maybe you need to run more efficiently on ad spend, right? I think, and it's not as hard of a conversation to have than maybe call it 2 years ago, when a lot of these brands in e-commerce were really drunk off of you know just pumping spend and growing as fast as possible. um a lot of the equity, dollars have dried up in the space, and even a lot of the lenders that I think have been pretty loose with their underwriting over the past couple years are
There were
really
a lot of e-com
free.
underwriters in the
Yeah,
last few years. I'm not going to name them, but they were out there in the market. You don't hear about them as much anymore.
yeah, they are tightening the screws, and um, it's and the other thing about these businesses, they can become like nice cash flow businesses. Like you can make a founder have a really nice life. You could, as a founder, you can make 7 figures a year running these, one of these businesses. I'm not saying it's easy, but it's possible. Like, why do you need to chase, um, growth at the expense of,
Mm-hmm.
of profitability and living to fight another day? So it's for some brands, the ones that are lucky that do have like those that fill in United States, some clothing brands don't necessarily need to manufacture in China. They can make in Pakistan, India, these other Bangladesh, these other places. But like really, like like a birdie, is made in China, or any like these hard goods or electronics. That stuff it's tough. It's going to be tough. It'll be interesting. A lot of people are going to get wiped out, but we'll see what happens.
I want to go back to a comment that you made about like raising prices. I have a saying in with my team, and like it's just
Yeah,
happened now and then. But like don't let a good crisis go to waste.
100 exact. It's the perfect excuse.
So if you see an opportunity to raise pricing, then and there's appetite for it in the economy, you're almost forced to do it because you can't like cut marketing that easily if you need that marketing to just generate the revenue to pay for everything else in the first place. Sure,
Exactly.
sure, there are efficiencies that you can find in G&A, but it only goes so far. At the end of the day, there's a minimum amount of administrative work and overhead you need for any company. And so I'm curious, like, I don't need all the details on what brands are doing what, but like how popular is that idea growing amongst the brands that you work with, like just to raise prices?
It's becoming more popular. Um, and I think a lot of the reason why, like I said, why people like why founders, brand founders don't raise prices is like their own psychology, right? Because they feel like their product is a reflection of themselves. Um, and brand founders tend to over index on what their customers think of them, right? Everyone thinks like it's human tendency, right? You think that everyone is always thinking about you when actually like most people don't even care about you or don't give you the thought a day, except maybe your mom, your wife, your husband, you know what I mean, your kids. I'm working with brands that are actively trying to increase prices, 10, 20, 25%. um and kind of how we measure that is on like on a revenue per session basis. um that's the metric that we look at. It ties in together the ad efficiency, performance, the AOV,
What's
the
AOV for our audience?
average order value, the conversion
Okay.
rate on site. So it's not a single data point of did we generate more revenue or not. Is did we generate more? How do you like essentially how do we generate more margin per visitor? But price testing is also something that I really believe that brands should be doing anyways. um and not to be afraid to take big swings, right? Like don't be afraid to test your price like 25% higher, right? You might miss, but maybe 15% works, right? And then you kind of dial in, maybe you test to 17 or 18% or 16% higher than your baseline. And typically what I see happen is brands that are in business for years don't increase prices.
Mm-hmm.
um Brands that were founded 5-10 years ago have the same price as when they launched. And the McDonald's dollar menu doesn't exist. It's the value menu now. You know what I mean? Because their prices go up. So I think it's probably like, even outside of a time like this, it's just such an easy one to try to find more margin in the business. um that I think people are at least the cohort of brands that I work with are more willing to implement that strategy.
I think it's gonna happen gradually. I think then, right? Though, because like you don't want to be the first. You don't want to be on the bleeding edge,
Right.
so to
Right.
speak. 'Cause that goes against what you're looking for to begin with. So it is a delicate balance there. Um, Maybe just a segue into another topic, but related to this on like managing margins and also thinking about accounting operations and finance operations. So a big portion of your P&L is that G&A function and the overhead. Curious, like sounds like that's another lever to pull to
Yeah.
maintain your P&L. What are the things that kind of like you've been focusing on in your role the last few years to optimize the finance and accounting function?
Yeah, so in the P&L and the G&A piece specifically, um a lot of these brands, and I hope this is the answer to your question. The A lot of these brands essentially load up with like a ton of like call it like software debt over time, right? It's so easy to get added. Like, hey, like use this software to increase your conversion rate. Use this software to increase your average order value. Use this to get better tracking on your ads, et cetera, et cetera. Right. So, part of the idea of e-commerce, right? That like this framework that I think about is, part of the appeal of e-commerce, right, is that it's cheaper to have a website than it is to have a physical retail location, right? But what ends up happening is over time, it's actually could cost like 5 to 10x more to run a website because you have 50 different software providers, saying that they could add incremental revenue to the business. Um, and over time, like most people don't even touch all the software that they're using, right? So there's brands that are spending like mid five, even six figures a month on software that could be cut.
And how do you advise your companies to like stay away from this? What's the like? Are you in every decision since you are the quote unquote fractional CFO, or like what's the typical? Because you have someone in marketing actually
Right.
that's at the companies you're working on. They're like insisting on like, well, I need to do this because otherwise we won't get the sales we need. What's your feedback to them, or how do you think about it?
Right. So I typically try to encourage brands to do something like a quarterly, like call it like a spring cleaning exercise, right? Where we're looking at, hey, like let's just do an audit of all the software costs that we had last quarter. And obviously, like I'm not going to tell someone on like a CMO or head of growth or marketing person, like, hey, like you absolutely don't need that. Like there could be a justification of why, but a lot of the times, more the exercise is like, hey, I didn't even know we were still paying for this. I thought we canceled this. Like, let's figure that out, right? Um, so that's more the exercise. And then if a company's in like a really bad spot, sometimes I'd say, hey, let's go negotiate with a software vendor, to try to get better terms, a lower pricing, etc. If that piece of software is a core is critical infrastructure. So there's that's kind of the exercise there. And then also like, really in like the past like year and a half, 2 years, like one thing that I've also been working with brands is that headcount piece, unfortunately. And not only internal headcount, but brands also tend to load up on freelance and agency costs. So a lot of brands have maybe like very small amounts of like W2 employees. There's a lot of like vendor agency service businesses, myself included, right? Most, if you're a brand that does $10 million, you don't need a full-time CFO, right? Your dollars are more better invested in uh strong growth marketing, strong product dev, people, channel distribution, Amazon, retail, etc., as opposed to making sure your financial model is like within like 1% accuracy, like that, you know what I mean? Um, but it's easy for brands to load up on those things, right? Like typically the start is I need a paid media agency, and then I need an ad creative agency, and then I need a conversion rate optimization agency, and then email SMS agency, and then all of a sudden, kind of going back to that model of, hey, how much does it cost to run a retail store, right, versus an e-commerce business? Now all of a sudden your fixed costs are $50,000 a month, just from a labor perspective, right? And not to say that's completely wrong or anything, but it's just something that brands need to be aware of.
Have you been feeling any pressure for your role, like given that you are an agent of all these brands, like where they're trying to reduce potentially your investment? I don't know.
No.
I've been in accounting and finance for almost 20 years. You know, my craft, right, and the work that I end up doing on a month to month, day to day basis, to some extent, like times are good, times are bad. You still need to get your debits and credits right. Like, so I'm just curious, but maybe some of these other things that you work on have been impacted.
Yeah, so what really does not get impacted, to your point, is like everyone needs their accounting. They need their books in order, right? If you're gonna go do a debt rate, if you're gonna go try to raise debt, if you're gonna try to go raise equity or whatever, like I mentioned earlier, like a lot of these lenders are that you might have, like you said, that you might have been hearing a lot about. You don't really hear about a lot. You don't have to name any names, or a lot. In my experience, like people are tightening screws, and that's like a core function of like the work just needs to get done, right? I have had conversations with founders and be like, you guys should not be paying me anymore.
Mm.
Like, you need to fix your business before it makes sense. Like paying someone like me, like if you and it'd be great for me to take your money, but the best thing to do for your business is focus on how does it survive over the next couple months, 2, 3, 4 months. I mean, not die, right? And part of that is role reduction. That's what it is.
On that topic, going to like, okay, so how is that business going to survive, and what's the runway there? Like the capital structure for like these different brands that you work on. You know, how do founders typically capitalize their brands when they're just starting out, or even as they scale?
It's a good question. A good answer is themselves. They a lot of these brands are bootstrapped, right? Someone taking 10, 20, maybe $50,000 and buying their first round of product, getting a website set up, starting to run some ads. Um, Really, that cohort of brands that raise a lot of equity, at least in hard goods, doesn't really exist in CPG. Like like true CPG, like food and bev, that's still, you know, you have like Unilever Ventures, some other like consumer good like CPG funds. But I would say that's maybe like 5 to 10% of the market. It's really not a large cohort of brands that go and raise equity. A lot of the brands are self-finance. They finance through capital, and then kind of like the next step is, or finance their own reinvestment of capital, and then really to grow. Like one of the hard things in e-commerce or in these brands is like the cash conversion cycle, right? Given that you have to pay for your manufacturing, and assuming you don't have great terms with your manufacturing, you need to pay for that inventory before you sell it. Um, but we could get down that rabbit hole. But kind of the next graduation from self financing and capital reinvestment is a lot of these like e-commerce lenders. These companies that are really set up to integrate with your Shopify, Amazon, etc., Facebook account, Google account, look at all like the data, and not automate an underwriting process, right? But they really understand these businesses compared to, or that's like the pitch at least, compared to maybe a traditional bank where like if you go apply for a line of credit after being in business for like 2 years with like drastically different numbers from year 1 to year 2, you're gonna be like, what the hell is this? Like, I don't know how to like underwrite this, right? So that's kind of the next step in the graduation is are these like e-com lenders.
How's that credit market going right now? Are you still seeing across your brands like you were mentioning earlier that lenders are tightening up? Is that because of the tariffs, or is that because of other economic uncertainties, or the environment in general, or maybe it's idiosyncratic to the businesses themselves? Like each business kind of has a different story.
Yeah, I think it's all of the above, to be honest. Um, I read a tweet somewhere. I need to validate this, so take that for what it's worth. Is that one of these lenders aren't giving anything to brands that where their manufacturing is in China. And I've
Mm.
never heard that question over the past 5 years of having conversations with these people. It used to be like easier back, like, even like 2-3 years ago, where you could just kind of plug, like I said, you could plug in your Shopify, your Amazon, Facebook account, etc. And they are pretty loose with their underwriting. They just look at the, you also integrate, or you plug into your QuickBooks or Xero or NetSuite, whatever you're using, and it was like, pretty easy. But now just like much more diligence. Like their underwriting is actually digging into like every single line on the balance sheet. They're running their ratios. They are asking about why revenue has dropped in Q1 after Q4, even though like obviously Q4 is like a huge time for e-commerce. But they are, and the amounts that they're giving out aren't as loose as they were. Like, and that's probably honestly why you probably saw some of these lenders kind of go under, right? Because their underwriting practices were so loose, and um they were just giving out bad loans to
Yeah.
to say it bluntly. But that's kind of been the experience over the last year and a half, I would say. And even in like the last 4 months, it's become a lot tougher. You know, there's this one brand that I have on the top of my mind. They were able to get a facility from a lender last year, and this year, we were like, hey, could you extend that same amount? They said no. They said we can't get you anything. And I was like, wow, like that's pretty crazy, So we'll see what happens.
Because you're exposed to so many different brands and companies that you work with, out of curiosity, because you're talking to multiple people who are facing the similar issues, where do you think this is going?
If I had to be super honest about that, which I'll be super honest about it, is I think there's going to be a large cohort of brand, like these small uh, business owners, brand owners, call like sub $10 million in revenue, that are just going to like get wiped out, right? That stage of growth from 3 to 10, figuring out how to financing that. Like, I don't, if they can't get, and some of these interest rates, these APRs that they're borrowing against are just like super high, like almost higher than credit card debt. Um, Not to mention that advertising only gets more expensive every year. CPMs, like the cost to advertise on these platforms, gets more expensive. So I think you're gonna really see a bifurcation where a lot of maybe like the mediocre or subpar, call it bottom, 30, 40, 50 percentile, these brands gets wiped out, and really the core thing that will prevent them from getting wiped out is how emotionally invested is the founder in putting in money, getting a second mortgage on the house, a HELOC, etc., and putting that capital to work in the business. But a lot of these businesses, like I said, that were already walking on tight, profit margins, if it's just going to get tighter, I don't necessarily see how there's a path forward, right? Or for a lot of these businesses, I think businesses that have a lot of returning customer revenue, right? So any consumable business is good, so that you're not relying on new customer acquisition. You're having like you have a channel of like really high profitability. Um, that's helpful to have.
Mm-hmm.
Um, but it's just going to continue to get more tough. And I think, I grew up in, the 2010s, in e-commerce, and I feel like, looking back, always looking back, you see there's like a lot of alpha. And I feel like you're just having a conversation with another friend recently and saying, yeah, I think a lot of this alpha is getting competed away, right? Where, you had like super low cost of advertising, etc. And at some point, is it just like another pizza shop? And how much better is your pizza shop compared to the pizza shop down the street? You know what I mean? Is like Dave Portnoy going to come and give you a better one bite pizza review rating than the person down the street? So
I
that's what
love that analogy. I
yeah.
love that analogy. I will say, the pizza shop, right? The differentiation, it ends up being your supply, your
Yep.
ingredients. So if you
Yep.
can supply better flour, better tomatoes, better, all that, like that's what ends up differentiating. And so it goes back to that to some extent. You got to put in the work to find a different supplier from your stuff to save on that cost of goods sold, to keep your business going. That's
Yeah.
interesting. And then if you could do that, but you still get the benefit of increased pricing, right? Because other people are
Yep.
increasing pricing because they haven't changed their supply. That's an interesting way to think about, again, going back to don't let a good crisis go to waste as long as you put in the effort. We always end our shows with a fun little segment called Finance Leaders Are Fun Too. And I prepped you for this, so I'm curious what you have to say. But I'd love to know the funniest, worst accounting debacle you've ever been a part of, or some unusual expense report, or just a finance joke, for the audience.
Yeah. So I don't know how creative I am, but I love Parks and Rec. So I was like, I'm gonna steal a joke from Ben Wyatt, and or if people who know that is the account on Parks and Rec. So I'll take the one where he's like, hey, we're all we do is like kick assets and take names. You know what I mean? So I'll leave it at that.
Are you kind of shortening the motto for every budget cycle,
Yep.
basically, to some extent?
Exactly.
Yeah, it makes
Exactly.
sense. I want to remark on one thing before we wrap up here, which is I love your story of, I know you went to school for a year, but you are extremely well versed in finance and accounting related to this particular field that you've specialized in e-com and CPG. And I think it goes to show, like, many, many years in America, everyone has taken on all the student debt to go to college and to
Oh,
do all that, right? And like,
I could talk about this topic probably longer than I could about e-commerce.
you, instead of going to school, and I did value my time in school as well. I learned a
Where'd you
lot.
go?
I learned, I use some of the stuff that I use a bunch of the stuff actually that I learned in school, both in the classroom and out, in my day-to-day life and
Where'd you go
work.
to school?
I went to school in DC. I went to Georgetown.
Oh, nice.
Yeah. But like, what's wrong with having an apprenticeship over that time period and learning the skills in the field,
You
right?
know,
Versus
I
just in the classroom.
I have a family friend who's high school senior right now, graduating high school, and she's an actress. She's like a child actress and brilliant young girl, right? And she's gonna go to NYU this year, next year, Tisch, the performing arts school, right?
Yeah.
You know how much it costs without scholarship or any financial aid
For
to
like
go to
45 grand, 50 grand at this point, maybe even more.
100 grand
A year?
a year,
That's with room and board and everything.
everything.
Holy smokes.
And so they got financial or like some package, and you know how much it got reduced. It got reduced by 30 grand, dude. If you took what is that, $280,000 or $400,000 and put that as a down payment on a piece of rental property or your first property, I don't know if that might be a better investment than going to. Isn't that crazy?
That's nuts. Holy smokes.
People don't understand, like when you're 18, you have no idea how any of this crap works. I don't know how any of this stuff works, but like that's a lot of money to spend, and
Yeah.
that's a long time to pay that debt off. You'd be making a lot of money out of college if you want to pay it off in a decent amount of time.
I will say one other thing though, like, when you talk about different people and their paths in life and school is a factor, you have to have the right combination of
100%.
personality and skills and entrepreneurship and self-propelling drive, so to speak. Um, I think having those qualities will work whether you go to school or not to some extent, right? But I
Right.
think there is a difference between folks who they need a little push. They need a little bit more structure to figure themselves out. But then the cost, it really comes down to when that is like the need that you have and you need that structure, et cetera, and you're kind of like following the crowd and going to a school, especially one that's very expensive, it just ends up being very costly. And so you have to have the right expectations for return on investment of what you're spending, not just the money, but also your time, right? Your time in this, in wherever it is that you're taking yourself, whether it's school or elsewhere. So
100%.
yeah. Richie, it was great talking to you. Thank you so much for joining the show.
Erik, thank you so much. It was an amazing time.